Well, I haven't been making overtly political videos for very long, and to be fair, I haven't really been alive for very long at the ripe old age of 23. I, like many of you, have been steeping in the world of online political discourse for what has felt like my entire life. I also made the grave mistake of pursuing a degree in a political social science, so luckily for me, my entire education has also revolved around various attempts to understand how politics operates in the age of the internet. And one of the most common political themes I've seen referred to in the past decade on social media is that of the alt-right pipeline. The idea is that there's a mechanism that exists on the internet which, primarily through recommendation algorithms on video sharing sites like YouTube or TikTok, captures the attention of your average Joe and slowly pushes their views further and further toward the right. Now, in academia, the alt-right pipeline term refers specifically to this algorithmic mechanism. However, I think most of us use it in a more broad way to sort of refer to the process of radicalization that can occur not just on video sharing sites, but on other social media, forums and Chan boards, and in certain offline local communities as well. And while there is a lot of media out there talking about the concept of the alt-right pipeline and how it works, I want to pose a different question today. Why is there no alt-left pipeline? We're going to walk through a quick framework to answer that question as simply as we can, but before we do that, a quick disclaimer. This is not going to be incredibly in-depth in terms of analysis, but I do plan on expanding on some of these topics in later videos. The main goal is to answer the question without overly complicating things. So, let's get on with that. There's a pretty logical through line that we can track in order to figure out why the alt-right pipeline works, and by negation, why there couldn't be a true alt-left pipeline of a similar nature. First, we need to sort out what the goal of a radicalization pipeline is. In my understanding, its goal is to capture the attention of one who is relatively disinterested in politics, the majority of people, and not only make them interested in politics, but eventually interested in radical politics and political activism in favor of the community that radicalized them. Since I'm American, I'm going to use our political parties in history for the rest of this video, but I think the ideas are relatively sound when used in other contexts. The most important component in the modern alt-right pipeline, in my opinion, is the media ecosystem that the Republican Party has been building since the 1990s. I could go on for hours about this one, but I will spare you that for now. All we need to know is that back in the early 1900s, there was a large public distrust in Republican economic policy after the Great Depression. This caused the Republican Party to more closely align itself with the Democrats, not just in economic policy, but later in other social policy efforts as well. The alignment between the two parties is what eventually allowed for the New Deal era to occur, since both parties agreed on a general direction for the country, only disagreeing on how to implement certain policies, for the most part. And as we well know, in regards to most social movements, each surge in a certain ideology is met with an opposing reaction, and this is effectively what allowed Ronald Reagan to take the presidency in 1980. What is important to understand at this point is that the strategy of the Republican Party began to shift. They noticed that their conservative policy proposals were relatively unpopular amongst the general public, especially in states required to win elections. If they could instead create a system where politics was more about culture than actual policies, they could attempt to convince Americans that they were the right choice to pick because they were the more patriotic or constitutional or working class party, despite there being a clear dissonance between those phrases and their actual policy proposals. And this is where the media ecosystem comes in. In the 1990s, the Republican Party and its donors began to invest a significant amount of funds and resources into building a widespread media apparatus with the goal of uniting the many small conservative coalitions throughout the country under a single narrative. The idea was to convince anyone from business owners to evangelicals to even your average dissatisfied American that the establishment Democrats were coming to destroy the very fabric of the United States and that the small town Republicans were going to stop them, so long as you donate to them and vote for them. This media narrative also consisted of broad moral panics, reimaginings of American history, and an oddly postmodern skepticism and pessimism not only about the Democrats, but also any Republicans that might sympathize with their causes. And this narrative caught on like wildfire, whether it be on AM radio with Rush Limbaugh or cable news with Sean Hannity and the Fox News crew, and it served as the foundation for the Republican strategy on how to win elections. If you can't make people vote for your party, make them vote against the other. Let's move on to the second point. These conservative narratives, like blaming economic instability solely on immigration or claiming that the LGBT community is corrupting children, bigotry in general toward any non-straight cisgender white male group, they generate fear. And let me be clear, both parties attempt to play into these narratives to try and win elections. However, it is important to note that there are multiple studies, which I've linked in the description, that show that individuals with conservative policy leanings are also more likely to focus on negative narratives and to have increased sensitivity to perceived threats. In that context, it makes sense why both parties try to use these narratives to win elections. Republicans need to activate every conservative that they can, and Democrats want to win on the margins by flipping center-right Republican voters. Both parties engaging with negative, fearful narratives is also great for the alt-right pipeline because fear makes people want to protect themselves and the things they love. And alt-right ideals are broadly centered around hatred toward outgroups, ultra-conservative social policies, and isolationism and nationalism, all of which can be fostered by the repetition and installation of fear. Leftist ideals, however, broadly advocate for community-focused solutions that are inclusive and perhaps most importantly, new or progressive. That's why the left can't necessarily utilize fear. While the right's goal is to protect itself against perceived threats, the left's goal is to overcome obstacles of fear, to incorporate and advocate alongside groups that are marginalized and exploited by neoconservative capitalism. Instilling fear would mean to shift the blame onto someone else. Leftist movements seek to take responsibility and first create change from the inside. Fear, in the way that conservatives utilize it, is incompatible with these goals, and in the modern media landscape means that leftist ideals are less likely to spread in the public consciousness than conservative ideals. Now the third point. Young people have a lot of problems going on all the time. That's kind of what being young is about. However, for the sake of this video, we have to look at what kinds of problems would cause someone to become susceptible to the siren's call of a radicalization pipeline. In Innuendo Studios' alt-right playbook, the accumulation of problems that lead someone into a pipeline is called soul sickness. This sickness can be brought on by many things, but perhaps most importantly are trauma and isolation, especially amongst men. And to be clear, this isn't me doing a feel bad for all white men because they're racist bit, but just hear me out. Folks that have had traumatic or life-changing events occur to them are most likely to become susceptible to these right-wing narratives, as they not only provide an outlet for anger and a community to fill in those support roles that might have otherwise been lost through their trauma, but also a series of common enemies to direct that anger toward as a community. This is why, anecdotally, divorced dads and young lonely men are the most likely to fall into these pipelines, since modern conservative social standards isolate and generally prevent men from expressing camaraderie or brotherly love for each other. Those pesky leftist community-oriented vibes are not at all what these folks are looking for. Often, they feel victimized by the state or by their ex-wives or their classmates or whoever else, and they just want a place to direct that anger. Rarely do they ever want a solution to it. Their problems are just a given to them. On to the fourth point. Any given person that feels vaguely victimized then is a lot more likely to pay attention to the more surface level commentators on the right, because they broadly speak to that person's worsening material conditions without getting too in the weeds about actual politics. In the 90s, this character was played by Limbaugh, Hannity, Buchanan, and Fox News in general, and nowadays it's Elon Musk, Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, and Ben Shapiro, just to name a few. The left simply does not have the same game. The Democratic Party funds liberal news outlets and commentators, not leftist commentators. So the only place folks are able to be introduced to leftist commentary is on BreadTube? I love PhilosophyTube and ContraPoints, of course, but they're just unable to meet the vast majority of people where they are, especially if those people are dissatisfied with what they perceive as culture war persecution against them. The Republican Party has bet its entire future on meeting these people, straight men and their wives, where they are, and not just slowly pushing them positively toward the right, but negatively away from anything perceived as leftist. And the last point, this funneling of regular Joes into rival political teams has created an environment in which parties seeps into our personal identities and our identities into our parties. The process of this occurring is one of a few forms of political polarization, and in a politically polarized country, the average person becomes significantly more anxious regarding political outcomes, and guess which party created a whole media ecosystem to take advantage of this anxiety? It's actually both parties, but the Democrats' media ecosystem is also primed against leftists, since leftist positions are too extreme to advocate for, which is also not the best hill for the Democrats to die on, because, to cite a recent example, some of Kamala Harris's most successful campaign promises during her 2024 election were her pledge to prevent grocery price gouging, her plan to have a 25% income tax for billionaires, and the strengthening of collective bargaining laws for unions, all of which polled with over 60% favorability amongst the general electorate, and all of which are leftist policy proposals, which she quickly abandoned due to her party's priming against leftists and their policies. Alright, let's wrap this all up into one tight bow and send you on your way. There is no alt-left pipeline because a political radicalization pipeline requires a few things to begin. Charismatic voices with massive investments from deep political pockets, subtly stoking the flames of fear en masse and in the public sphere. The Republican Party specifically engineered the right-wing media apparatus to do these things, and there are no equivalent voices on the left, no deep leftist pockets to invest in the potential voices that there may be, and perhaps most importantly, no additional fear generated by the community-focused ideals of leftist politics. Even if fear is generated by the left, as we saw earlier, that fear will make someone more likely to adopt conservative policy preferences. And this is why your average dissatisfied American won't fall down a pipeline to the alt-left, and is also perhaps why the left should attempt to increase organizational efforts rather than attempting to go high by meeting the right in the marketplace of ideas, because the very fabric of the marketplace is stacked against them. And that's it for this lovely political video. Next week, we're going to be getting into a non-political topic. We're going to be talking about fake plants and nature simulation devices, as I call them. Like the grounding mats that, I don't know if you've seen them on like social media recently, but it's these ads for these like yoga mats where you plug them in and it takes like the ground charge from the outlet, and then it makes you feel like you're outside on the ground, but you're inside now and you don't have to breathe all that pesky fresh air and whatever. We're going to be talking about stuff like that. So subscribe if you want that, or subscribe if you want videos like this, or subscribe if you just can't get enough of my silky smooth voice. I guess. We're always doing stuff here. I'll see you in the next one.